I don't know. I don't know what to say. Terry doesn't know how to do a bumper, so what we're going to do is we're going to record Terry doing a not a bumper, because Terry's really shitty at doing bumps for shows. He's just going to be like, oh, I'm Canadian, you should listen to him because I'm Canadian. And he's also Canadian, so yeah, he's horrible at this.
All right, let me give it a
Mr.
try.
Dragonbeard show. Yeah. Oh, it's 4 o'clock in the fucking morning. This is Terry Saker. Listen to Apostacy now, assholes. That was the best one that you had all night. That was the best one. This is Terry Saker. Listen to Apostacy now, assholes.
Terry Saker, listen to Apostacy now, assholes.
Welcome back to another episode. Our next guest for the next episode is going to be Terry Saker. He's a friend of mine. He's a fellow Canadian. I think you'll enjoy that. I'll be upfront with you. This episode's probably going to bother some people. It's going to be sensitive material in some ways. Something that I think that we should talk more about. And our guest is somebody I think you'll find fascinating. Her personal life experience, the books that she's written, which I encourage people to read. It's about how men and women treat one another and think about one another, and more importantly, how we treat the ideas about family and our kids. I want to thank Erin Pizzey for coming out and having this conversation. Even if you don't agree with us, that's fine. If you want to leave comments to the opposite opinion or a different opinion, that's fine. And I hope that you'll at least listen through and consider what she has to say. And if you do turn it off, well, I guess that's your choice. I'm not going to hold it against you. And I'll see you on the next episode. But for now, stay tuned.
This is Smashlock and Mr. Dragonbeard from Apostacy Now. If you have any questions or comments, or would like to be a guest on our show, contact Mr. Dragonbeard at...
You can reach us at the WordPress page we have set up for apostacynow.net. Leave a comment there. You can also reach us through my Twitter at Mr. Dragonbeard, all lowercase. Or even better yet, leave a comment or some type of a post to get in contact with us over on Facebook. We have a page, Apostacy Now Podcast. Everyone's welcome.
Leaving us with the Phantom.
Can you please not call him that? It sounds silly.
Sillier than the arsonist, which starts with arse.
Because I'm very much a skeptic. I'm more of a skeptic than I am an atheist. I mean, atheist is a conclusion based on my skepticism.
You'll have to come like a little child to the foot of the cross.
That attitude is what is responsible for the rise of atheism.
That's not what Islam is all about. Islam is peace.
What is the penalty for leaving the Muslim faith? With the death penalty. Thank you.
This is Apostacy Now.
For people to get the information correct before they start yapping.
Get ready to root for the bad guys.
Begins with E, evidence. All the evidence.
Erin Pizzey.
I've listened to you a few times on podcasts, usually through AVfM, but I've seen some stuff on YouTube as well. Probably the best way to start it off is just to ask you, I have a lot of listeners, I think, that are younger than I am. I'm 37. And for myself, I've grown up in a world where there's always been shelters, women's shelters, etc. You were involved back in the day in getting that set up, if I understand correctly, back in England, right?
Yeah, it was 1971. I'm 75 now. I was 30-something, 32. I opened actually a community centre for mothers and children. Because I ended up having furious rows with the emerging women's movement, who, as far as I was concerned, were busy preaching that marriage was a dangerous place for women and children. And to cut a long story short, I marched off and started what I believed, which was the community centre where women who were at home with their children could come and use their talents and bring their children. Because at that point, there was nothing. If you had children, you were isolated in your own homes. So what I hadn't expected was that a woman would come in who was horribly bruised and say, nobody will help me. And my mother was Canadian, incidentally.
Okay.
So I'm half Canadian.
Huh.
And,
I don't know if you know, but I'm Canadian as well, so.
I can hear it. And she was very physically abusive to me, particularly because I looked like my father and she hated my father. He was a monster. He was 6'4", of a raging human being who had terribly damaged by his own background. Neither of them really should have had children. She actually only wanted one son, and poor woman had twin girls. And then she did have her son, and she didn't actually, once he got to the age of 7 and he was becoming, a normal smelly little boy, she dumped him in a prep school, and that was it. She never really paid attention to him thereafter. So yes, I had an awful lot of experience. So when Kathy came in, I was completely even-handed. I knew it wasn't a gender issue from the very beginning. I knew that children born into these kind of violent families like we were, the chances of repeating the patterns are huge, unless you're lucky enough to have help, and then you can transcend. So very quickly, the little tiny house, only 4 rooms, started to fill up with women, some as violent as the men they left, but all of them certainly victims of very severe physical violence, because otherwise at one point, to give you an idea, in these 4 small rooms, there were 56 mothers and children, with the children sleeping on mattresses on the floor, and the women lined up against the walls, sleeping with their heads on their knees, but it was better than going back to where they'd come from. Wow. And then, thereafter is the whole history. There is a book which you can buy in Canada. It's called, on Amazon, it's called This Way to the Revolution, and it's about the whole time of the 70s, when I first started the refuge movement, and what happened, because it was hotly contested. My attitude was hotly contested by the radical feminists, and I've been embattled with them now for all these years. It's nearly 50, coming up for 50 years.
That's a long time to have a battle. I find different types of people that go by that term. Assuming that you're talking about the ones who tend to come with a chip on their shoulder, hard edge.
Well, no, I think the thing is that all of us who, the emerging women movement, men and women, were perfectly willing as equity feminists to support the idea of equal rights for women. Yeah. And particularly in my time, you see, because certainly growing up in the 50s, I was getting married in 61, and I had to ask. I had to prove to my doctor I was getting married to be allowed contraception. And you had, as a woman, you couldn't sign a mortgage. You had to get your father or a man to sign a mortgage for you.
Wow.
And if you remember, in those times, abortions were illegal. And I saw 2 women. One died of infection, and the other was very, very ill after backstreet abortions. It was a very, very hard time. So understandably, there was a great deal of anger. But what most people didn't realize is, and you had to be there in those huge collectives, which I was, to see that actually it was nothing to do with women, this women's movement. It was a Marxist movement run by women. And actually it was very clever politically, because it started in Washington when an awful lot of feminists had gone down to the South to help liberate the black communities and desegregate the schools. They came back. And there's a book that explains it all, and they agreed that they would move the goals from capitalism, which is what both men and women were fighting, and the new goal would be patriarchy, and that was all men. And from then onwards, they've built up really an enormous multi-million project which is across the Western world, and it is totally biased against men, families, fathers and boys.
Yeah, so you were...
Nowhere more strongly than Canada, I might say. I came over about 10 or 12 years ago with Ann Cools, your senator.
Okay.
And we did it's a 6 weeks tour right the way across Canada, visiting all the men's groups. And it was appalling. It was appalling.
Yeah. Wow. So, yeah, the first time I grew up kind of with the assumption that anyone who said that they were women's rights, that they were feminist, that would mean equality. And there's certain concepts that I was taught, in school, television, and only when I hit a certain age, it's only been actually in the last few years, that I've gone from basically I think in the past I've even encouraged some women to adopt the term for themselves, because I felt that they needed to be a little bit more self-assertive in life. But I had never really been challenged with the more extreme views that you're talking about, where it's transformed. A lot of people assume it means equal rights.
I think that's true, because these are mostly people who are actually not on the coalface. They haven't been thrown out of their houses, barred from seeing their children, false allegations of sexual abuse. So only when it touches people within the families, maybe a member of the family is a victim, either a man or a woman or a child, that suddenly the whole thing springs into reality.
Yeah, and I think the expression that I've heard you say is that people, I'm not sure how you phrase it exactly, but something to the effect of people assume that violence is a gender issue, but it's actually a family issue.
Yes, I've always said that. It's generational. If you look at your own families, you can see. I could see certainly in mine, there were 3 generations I could trace it back to. And that would have been my great-grandparents, my grandparents, who migrated on the one side, my mother's side, from Ireland, and then ended up in Ottawa. Portland was the village, I think, where they ended up. And her father was alcoholic and apparently very violent. And on my father's side, the same thing. His father and grandfather, they were all alcoholics. Mind you, and his mother, he was the youngest of an Irish Catholic family of 17. And there was a lot of violence in that family. So you can see in time, and because when women came in, I used to do questionnaires with them, and I used to do 3 generational, to have a look, because I believed that it was generational. And it is, to learn pattern of behavior. And actually now, with MRI scans, they know that the fetus in the womb, the baby, can be affected by domestic violence, because when you smoke a cigarette, you share it with your baby. When you take a drink, you share it with your baby. And when you experience the chemicals of rage or fear, you share those with the baby. So the baby is born wired up.
Yeah. Domestic violence is it spreads. It affects everybody. I totally agree with you. I don't know. I think it's for me, the area that I have found the most sticky is that there is a sense that some people have, that when you try to talk about what people are talking about when they use the word feminist, that you're not allowed to split people up into different groups and different motives.
Who's the people who say that?
Well, I'm online. I have different discussions with people, right? And even in real life, I've sat down and had discussions about it where, whereas a lot of people that I know, when they say that they're a feminist, I can argue with them about some misconceptions they have at the core of what they've been sort of taught.
Mm-hmm.
But their goal is to find equality. And so
that's absolutely fine. No one's arguing that. I think the question you ask, if somebody comes up and says, look, I'm a feminist, why do you object to me? I ask a simple question. I say, do you believe that we all need to fight for equality for women? Yes or no? Or do you believe that all women are innocent victims of men's violence because men are part of the patriarchy? If they say yes to that, then they're radical feminists.
Right. Yeah. The reason I think that what you have to offer when you talk about these issues is that you have personal experience and you have an understanding, not just from seeing it from a distance. You've actually interacted with it over the years. You've watched it kind of go from.
I work with both men, women, and children, both victims and people who are designated as perpetrators and very often aren't. I'll be coming actually to Canada, hopefully, in June for a conference, so I'll be in Toronto.
Oh, nice.
Where are you?
I'm a couple hours from Toronto. I'm near London, Ontario.
Oh, right, yeah. So maybe we'll see you there. It's Attila Vincer who's giving the conference, and Anne Cools will be there. I'll be so pleased to see her.
Oh, wow. If I can figure out the date, I might be able to be there. I'm a truck driver, so what's that?
The 6th to the 8th of June.
Well, I'll figure it out on my calendar later.
Okay.
My real name is Corey, by the way.
Okay, Corey.
Yeah. That's just in case we meet, then you won't have to call me Mr. Dragonbeard.
Yes, I was wondering that. Do you have a beard, by the way?
Yes, I do. I've had a beard for many years, so yeah.
Okay, well, it won't be too confusing then. Any beard I see, I'll say, is that Corey?
Yeah, I always have children, young children trying to pull it, and older children asking if they can pull it. But you were in Canada not too long ago, if I remember correctly, trying to help people organize to start shelters here for men, if I remember correctly.
No, I wasn't. I was a good 12 years ago. I was with Anne Cools.
Okay.
I was involved with various things that happened, including, do you remember Earl Silverman hanged himself?
Yes, I did hear about that, yes.
Yeah, and there were groups trying to set up shelters for men, and a great feeling of guilt from an awful lot of people because nobody really expected that to happen. But then when you look at the figures for suicide among men, and to be honest with you, it's 4 times higher than women, and it very often is because they have been deprived of their families and lost everything.
Right. And, when I have disagreements with people, like I say online or in person, I try to make it clear that I'm not denying or being insensitive that the fact that women have had an uphill battle in many ways. And in many ways, there still are injustices that can be pointed out and addressed. I don't try to diminish that.
But this is the human condition, and it's not just women, it's also men. I was born in China, and I grew up in the Middle East, and you live in different cultures. You recognize that we need to fight for each other. It's not a gender issue.
Right. Well, and full disclosure, my rude awakening for a lot of stuff came through recently going through the family court system for, me and my now ex-wife she was 5 when we separated. And, I was actually stunned, repeatedly about how things were going.
Yeah.
It just didn't seem reasonable, but all of the, it's not that the people in the court are unreasonable. Like, the judge isn't unreasonable, the lawyers aren't even unreasonable, but the system is set up in a way that they can only do certain things. And a certain process has to be followed. That seems kind of crazy.
But one of the problems you have to remember, Canada is probably older in terms of the feminist movement than any of the other countries, because Trudeau, in his time, pumped huge sums of money into the then emerging feminist movement. So they've had a long time to get into positions of power. And most of the training of all the judiciary, all the lawyers, all the services are done by radical feminist organizations.
Wow.
So you have this problem that people sitting there, on the whole, have been brainwashed into thinking that all women are innocent victims of men's violence. And so whatever you're saying, it's going through that lens.
Well, it's interesting because the experience I had was that, starting with, I had, the night that I left, I had to call police to my apartment. And like, I wasn't, I won't go into details. I'll just say I wasn't bleeding or anything, but it was out of control enough that I called the police, which is a statement in itself for me to call the police. There were 2 lady officers that showed up, and a lot of people's assumption is that the police will be on the women's side, and they were not. They were actually very professional. They were urging me to press charges, which I wouldn't do. I think that's pretty typical of people in my situation for some reason.
It's typical of male chivalry, and often it works against the best interests of the child.
And it did. It really has.
Yeah.
And then they tried to convince me to take my child. She was sleeping at this time. Try to take my child out of the apartment while they were there, and I wouldn't do that either. So,
good heavens, you were very naive.
Yeah. Oh, I was totally naive. And so, anyways, the officers, they did their job very well. And I haven't seen the report, but it's been entered into the court, and apparently it was like they did their job, and they were not, as you say, they were not naive about the reality of how these situations go. They assessed it very quickly that there was something wrong with this situation. And in court, it seems to me that the judge and then later the social worker were very quickly, same with the psychologist involved with my daughter, they all seemed to understand that there were certain problems with my wife right away.
Yeah.
But they had to slowly work the system and slowly get to the point where we could get to where we are now, where some progress is being made. It's taken like 1.5 years.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Did they at any point perhaps think that she might have a personality disorder?
Well, that is now the concern. So the recommendation finally from the social worker has been that one of the many recommendations, one of them is that she get an evaluation, psychological evaluation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because she is obviously the primary caregiver for our child. And enough people in her investigation. Are you familiar with over here? I don't know if you have it in England. The Office of the Family Lawyer.
Well, we have an organization called CAFCAS that represents the best interests of the child.
Okay, probably the same type of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so the social worker was sent in to represent our daughter without concern to what my wife or I would want. And her review was quite scathing about what's been going on towards my wife, and quite supportive about my position and concern about a number of things, right? So and that recommendation, hopefully the judge will take it seriously. And because even I have been investigating different types of psychology over the years, the last few years, trying to get some kind of grasp of understanding of what's been happening to her as she's been deteriorating. This behavior has been emerging, right?
Well, presumably, I mean, she's one of the major conditions that I have to deal with for women, and particularly it affects women. It can affect men, obviously, but it's a condition called narcissistic exhibitionism, and they make very dangerous parenting because essentially the needs for the narcissist to continually be in the center of attention, to be continually adored, and any attempt to challenge a narcissist, and you just end up with a ball of rage.
Oh, wow. Well, I guess hopefully we'll see. I'll be able to learn what it is. It'll be nice to hear somebody from an outside perspective. And I get the sense, this is kind of like as an aside, this probably works for anyone in any situation. I got the sense that as this deterioration began, at first it was not this bad. She was just kind of quirky at first, right?
Yeah.
And then a number of years back, it started, and I told her at some point, look, you need to go and talk to someone about this. And I think if she had, she probably could have mitigated how far down the rung she fell. I'm not a professional, but it's a guess.
Well, with a personality disorder, one of the problems is that as soon as they're challenged or not believed or not the center of attention, that's when they begin to deteriorate. And she's got no one, presumably, unless she's moved another man in, she's got no one there to bounce off. So she's probably very lost.
Yeah.
And she's being questioned by social workers. That'll make her very angry. Because you are the enemy.
She's definitely angry. Yeah. The best I can do is that when the time that we do see each other is when I see my daughter, right? I get to see her on Saturdays. And like, that's what I mean about the system. Like, it moves so slow. I was denied access for 9 months. Yeah. And then when that got to court and that was realized, the judge, tried arguing with my wife and her lawyer because they wouldn't stop arguing with him. And then finally appeased them with 6 hours on Saturday. And that's what I've been at since. But the 9 months of denied access was never dealt with in any way.
And the tragedy, you see, and what you've got to be so careful of, is parental alienation. Because if she, at this very young age, begins to talk about you as the monster, as the bastard, as the man who's making life impossible, if she sees her mother crying and weeping and wailing, the child's core beliefs about who you are will be set in her brain.
Yes.
And this is what they realize. And then suddenly, not only will the child begin to believe that you are the monster, but also will feel furiously guilty when she spends any time away from her mother.
Yeah, and see, now I've got an education in the things you're talking about from firsthand, or I wouldn't have known any of this stuff. But again, to the credit of people involved in the court, the social worker pointed that out exactly in the paperwork, exactly what you just said. Mm. She cited a couple of examples of how she knows my wife has been doing that.
Yeah.
Saying things about me to my daughter when I'm not there. Mm. And she put that into her recommendations as being extremely important that we have not split custody, but joint custody, so that I have a say in everything that goes on with her medical and her education.
Would you not go for custody completely?
Well, see, that's what my lawyer is going to do now is he's going to talk to her lawyer about the recommendations so my lawyer used to be a family court judge. Mm-hmm. And then he retired, and then he came out of retirement to take a few cases here and there. So I actually was really lucky that he took my case.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so what he said is, we're going to put this forward and say, let's adopt all the recommendations and put that to the court, and they'll put it in place.
Yeah.
And if they say no, then he's going to say, okay, then because you're ignoring these recommendations when we go to court, we're going to tell the judge that we're going to change over to full custody for our side.
Yeah.
And it's really, if she does that, she's just leaving us no choice. Like, I've tried to be reasonable every step of the way to.
Can I just say something to you?
Yeah.
You know how many men have said that to me? My answer is, because you're male, you are rational. And the point is, this is going to be an irrational situation, and you have to learn to think like your wife, irrationally.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, you're going to play into her hands.
I mean, setting aside my own personal lessons, though, going along and learning this all, like I say, it's a rude awakening, right? I was learning through experience. The thing that anyone should be able to look at from the outside and start dissecting from, watching maybe someone they know go through it, is that the people involved have been very responsible, except maybe her lawyer, but I can't tell because she's got to represent her client. But everyone seems to have understood what's going on and has tried everything to work towards getting us to this point.
You're extremely lucky.
Yeah. So I don't think everyone in the system is to blame, but the system itself is set up to favor one side. Which
is the feminine side, yeah.
Yeah, and I have a real problem with that, and I think a lot of people don't understand until they, like myself, go through it, or someone they really care about gets put through their ringer.
Then suddenly the whole horrific thing falls apart and they realize. I think one of the other things that I've been saying, which I know is not going to happen in my lifetime, the way you have a personality disorder, I think you need to take it out of the courts, because the courts can't deal with them. Because you have to remember, anybody with a personality disorder, lying is a way of life for them. Doesn't matter how many oaths you're all made to take, they'll lie. It's a level playing field at the moment. So you'll find yourself in a situation where everything you say is believed, everything she says. But the problem is that with a personality disorder, they are massively manipulative.
The Family Terrorist by Erin Pizzey. A relatively well-balanced person, however, will not only be aware of their own distress, but also sensitive in some degree to the suffering of the other family members. For example, reasonably well-balanced parents, when facing divorce, will be most concerned with their children's emotional well-being, even beyond their own grief. Not so the emotional terrorist. To the family terrorist, there is only one wronged, one sufferer, only one person in pain, and this person is the terrorist herself. The terrorist has no empathy and feels only her own pain. In this manner, the terrorist's capacity for feeling is narcissistic, solipsistic, and in fact, pathological.
And usually, I think you're very lucky in that you got this judge as your lawyer. But usually, what happens is that the person who has the personality disorder uses the courts often like their own personal theatre.
Yeah.
And they can drag the whole thing out for years.
Yeah, and the entire time, I'm watching my daughter, try and struggle with trying to understand what is happening and trying to please her mother and also try to be happy with her dad.
Yeah. And bearing all that weight on her shoulders.
Yeah.
And that's what's so very unfair, because your ex-wife is putting an enormous amount. It's what people who can't put the children's interests first, and she can't. Her needs will always come above her daughter's, and her daughter is a weapon.
I think a huge step forward for courts. Like I say, my lawyer used to be a judge for many years.
Yeah.
As he told me, and I was stunned, he said there is no money set aside to pay for psychologists for any kind of evaluation for the court.
Yeah.
And I couldn't understand, sometimes isn't it necessary to have an evaluation? And he says, well, that money's just not set aside, so if we have to have one, you're probably going to have to pay for it, for her. I said, that seems really bizarre. There's got to be times when people, I don't know how I'm going to afford it. It's going to be pretty expensive.
Yeah.
There's got to be times when people there's no way they can afford it.
That's quite right. And the thing is, it's a very difficult business, because the whole concept of personality disorders is fairly new, and nobody really wants to have to make a judgment. And one of the reasons why it is now becoming, and it will change, is because MRI scans can show the damage in the brain. And no doubt your ex-wife came from a very damaging background.
I'm not sure about that, because all the things that she said about her family tend to shift around.
Yeah, of course, you're right.
So I know, I've met some of her family. The people I've met, though everyone has their, like I say, their issues, their quirks. They all seem to be nice people.
Everybody seems nice, yeah.
Yeah, they all seem nice.
Going on underneath, you have to worry about.
So I'm not sure exactly what happened along the way, but I think one of the missteps is that I've heard this before. Psychology has some problem with feminism as well, where if the term hysteria, for instance, is used, feminists will say that's a sexist term.
No, it's called a histrionic personality disorder. It affects both men and women.
Yes, that's what I try telling them, and they're like, no, it's used against women to silence them.
No. Well, I mean, then there are people with core beliefs, and you won't change their beliefs because they're core beliefs. They're what they actually have built because of their own sad experiences. If you challenge them, you'll just make them angry.
Yeah, and the one that I think that we're talking about here is personality disorder is often conflated with attacking the person. You know, if I say that that my ex-wife has these behaviors and I think it might be personality disorder, my wife would probably return, well, you're just trying to degrade me or undermine me. But because...
Actually, no, because I think one of the things that you could say to her, which you can't, you could say, no, because it gives me a greater understanding of why you do the things you do.
Right, and from my perspective, I've always said that I want my daughter to have a healthy relationship with her mom. Like, that's really important to me.
But she won't.
Yeah.
It's not possible.
Well, if she gets treatment, if she would switch her attitude at some point and just reach out for help, I think that could change. But the personality
to rescue her.
Well, I was going to say I'm not in any delusions about that. The personality disorders are the most difficult to treat because they don't do that. They kind of perceive it as part of themselves.
Yeah, if you could, the thing is, if you could wish for her to have insight, she wouldn't be who she is.
Yeah, yeah.
I know and often when I look into the past histories of people with personality disorders, I can feel an enormous amount of compassion for them. But I have to be straight here. My mother was a classic narcissistic exhibitionist. I was lucky as a child because I very early on realized that she had no time for me. I looked like my father, which gave her a good reason to hate me. My twin sister, she was much closer to my mother, and she was far more damaged than I was because I stood aside. And one of the things is you can't afford to give too much credence to whether your wife's going to change or not, because what you need to do is rescue your daughter. Certainly, when she's much older, she can negotiate her understanding her mother, but at this young age, she's in danger.
Yeah. Yeah, and I told them in the system every step of the way, because at one point I thought I was being so reasonable with them that they might misunderstood. So I laid it out for the social worker and my lawyer point blank. I said, I am willing to change. Like I say, I'm a truck driver. I said, I am willing to change everything right away and become primary caregiver if we can't work something reasonable out here. Like if something can't change, that's what I'm willing to do. I just didn't want them to think that I was trying to find a way out of that responsibility. Yeah. It is a difficult place for people to be in. And yeah, I was listening to you talk one day and I remember you were talking about that you were helping set up these shelters. And I thought, yeah, I've never known a world without that.
But you see, the tragedy from the very beginning is recognizing, as I did, that it wasn't a gender issue, and men were also victims. When I tried to set up a men's house, I actually got the physical building, but none of the men who were millionaires in my early experience with shelters, none of them would give me a penny for men. And everybody's found this. Anywhere where they're trying to set up shelters, whether it's America or Australia or New Zealand, when it comes to a place for men, nobody wants to know.
Wow. This is like, you set up for women, people reach out in compassion.
Sure, yeah.
And then if you do it for men, it's kind of like a thing where they're like, well, those men must be weak, or they deny that it exists, the problem.
It's how men think about men. The only time you actually get traction is when it's happened to them. And then they suddenly realize. But by that time, they're usually homeless and penniless. And I noticed in Canada, if a man couldn't pay his child support, which often they can't by the time they've been ruined, they go to jail, they lose their passports, they lose their driving license. It's a tragedy.
Now, when you first started setting up these shelters, was there a time that many feminists maybe started using your name in a positive way before they decided to?
No. It was a fight straight off, because when I opened the first shelter, there was nothing in the world. There was no recognized place for women to come to with children who would take them in and fight the battle. I was the first. And I knew, and this is the frightening thing, having been thrown out by the whole feminism, I knew that once the whole story broke and the idea that, yes, domestic violence is happening behind front doors, and there was any media attention and money, that the feminists would come, and they did. I had 3 years, from 71 to 74. By 74, they had realized that now they had just cause, violence towards women, and they also had funding, and it's become $1 billion industry. And slowly, as the movement grew and more radical feminists came in, the harder it came for men to have any sense of justice.
Oh, that's, so it's like a fight for control, a fight for the public dialogue.
Well, no, because it isn't a fight in a way. It's a pushover, because there isn't any dialogue in Canada. There are men's groups. There are men trying to get justice and shelters, and women helping with them. There's a huge amount of women who understand exactly what we're saying. But I don't know the setup with your government. But certainly in our country, the women's minister, and she's been minister for quite a while, and she's also leader of the shadow cabinet, the Labour leader. Harriet Harman has publicly said in 1990 that men are not necessarily harmonious to family life. And Patricia Hewitt and other our members of Parliament said, yes, we need men in primary schools, but men can't be trusted with children. I mean, this is the attitude coming from our governments. Just recently, our Prime Minister, David Cameron, lauded the role of single-parent mothers and called all other men feckless fathers. No understanding that the majority of men are not feckless, they are banned and barred from their families.
Yeah, I've noticed a number of things have made a lot more sense to me since my understanding has become less about what was presented to me and more about what is really going on in the family courts. Everything has been set up to make me walk away.
Yes.
Even the understanding that I have actually been surprised that she hasn't accused me of certain things in the court. She did accuse me of being violent, but the court seems to have ignored that when she said it. She said it twice, and the judge seems to have pretended like he didn't hear it. So I've been quite fortunate that way. But now I'm looking around at a number of my even cousins, a couple of my cousins, where their father wasn't in their life, and now they've reconnected, and there's a lot of anger towards their mother, and people don't understand why. And I think it's because the system was set up to say to the father, look, if you pursue this, you might go to jail, or you can walk away.
What they told me in Canada is, and what I saw for myself, is the shelters are bunkers for brainwashing women. And it was very interesting because they described, man comes home and he finds his house empty, his children gone, and various possessions taken. That's called hoovering. So she's gone off to the shelter and he won't know where she is. Nobody has to tell him by law. Then, if the woman finds that she can't get what she wants quick enough, then she would be advised to use the silver bullet. And the silver bullet is being accused of sexual abuse. And my advice to anybody who's got a wife who's liable to make false allegations, if you have the child, always make sure you have a witness.
Yeah.
It's too dangerous otherwise. Because even if it's just set up as a scare, that can take another whole couple of years while you go through all the evaluations again.
Yeah, it's crazy. A couple of years ago, I started listening to a few programs, and my understanding of where a lot of these problems come from in a larger sense, like society-wise, how people kind of they don't question it. They're presented with something like I was presented with a lot of these ideas that feminism wants people to perceive in a certain way. I absorbed them because I wanted to be a good person. I cared about women.
You want to be a good man.
Yeah.
And you are chivalrous, and because I think men have a chivalrous gene, and there is something very shame-making about you daring to question women.
Right. And a lot of the ideas that feminism says they own are good ideas, but they don't own them exclusively. So where I became aware of how to start tackling these issues was I listened to a program. It actually was in Canada back from, I think, 1987, called the Massey Lectures, had Doris Lessing.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, she is someone, that's why I asked you actually, if you at first were received or cited at all by feminists before they turned on you. She had that experience where she was at first claimed to be one of theirs as an author. She's one of ours. She's a feminist. And in her talk at some point, I'm not sure if it was this one or another one, she said that she realized that they were saying that about her book.
Yeah.
And so
she said quite early on, no, I'm not a feminist.
Yeah.
No, I from the very beginning, I think I swallowed what was being put in the newspapers in the 70s, late 69 in America, 70s in England. And I sat up one day reading this newspaper article about this wonderful new movement for women, where women would stop competing with each other, we'd start working together.
Yeah.
And I got very excited because I very naively thought this was about creating community centres where we could meet with our children. So when I went up to the first big collectives and I heard them standing there saying that the family is a dangerous place for women, and any of us who were married and sleeping with our husbands were sleeping with the enemy. But most of all, I recognized the Marxism in it all, because my father and mother were captured by the Chinese when they went to Tientsin in 49, and they were under house arrest for 3 years. So I knew a lot about communism. And so when I saw the demands of 24-hour nurseries and all the rest of it, and then we were told that we had to meet in collectives in our own homes, and you invited your friends once a week, and you had to raise your consciousness and call each other comrade, I said at the time to all of them, so this has nothing to do with the women's movement, and it never was.
Yeah.
It was just a different way of funding. So now women have created a woman-only place for themselves, whether it's in universities, and as you know, men are being pushed out of universities, whether it's in publishing, wherever it is, they're in positions of power, particularly in the judiciary and the legal system.
Yeah, and so it's ideology. That's what you're talking about, right? It becomes an overarching ideology.
It is.
That includes a certain structure of ideas, and you have to conform to all of them, or you are a bad person. And you need to be.
You're a victim blamer. You're a hater of women.
Yeah. So that's
create hate crimes.
I'm a part of a number of groups. Some of them secularist groups online, and even in real life, when I talk to people now, that's what I say is that what you're talking about, I don't have a problem us discussing it as long as we're allowed to disagree on different points. I'm not interested in ideology. Individual ideas, individual specific things, we should be able to disagree without seeing the other person as an evil person.
But then you see, you're being rational. To be absolutely honest with you, the majority of people I've met who are so-called leaders of the women's movement, and I won't name them, but I know them because I've been there from the beginning, they're women who I've always considered had serious personality disorders. And it's a religion for them. And you dare, it's a heresy to say anything that isn't what is coming out of their mouths. And it's enormously powerful. And my real concern is Hillary Clinton. If she gets in, then she is one of the arch enemies for women, actually.
Yeah, I remember, so this is how quickly it's changed. I remember when she was running against Obama for trying to get the nomination. I actually supported her because of a lot of her stances on things and various reasons.
Yeah.
And I was a little disappointed when he got it. It will set aside any agreements or disagreements I have with him because that's just politics. But now over time, I've been hearing some of the statements she's made as senator, they don't call it minister, Secretary of State.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them have been crazy talk. And it's just this wild, off-the-wall feminism. The statements just are not, I don't know, like, there's no planet for them.
No, they're not. No, and I know that Violence Against Women's Act, which is in America, and they have, I think, something like $1 billion and something a year in terms of funding, largely from taxpayers. Most of that money goes towards so-called perpetrators, all men, of course, and the programs use the Duluth model. And it's a terrifying prospect because the man, before he can even receive this so-called treatment, has to agree that he's a member of the patriarchy, and then by definition he's guilty.
The patriarchy thing, I don't think that I really understood that it was what they use it as. I thought that it was just a reference to an older time when men ruled things and had a religious connotation.
No. It is by a male child is a potential perpetrator. When they used to picket me for all those years, I'd have banners outside saying all men are rapists, all men are batterers. And that is the ideology. Men are the enemy.
Right. And that's what I've come to realize is that when I get into these discussions now, that this, like, because I was raised, I don't go to church anymore, but I was raised in church. So when they talked about patriarchs in church, they were talking about Abraham or, Isaac and maybe King David, for some. So it just meant, it had this kind of cultural, pseudo-religious reference, to these men way back in the day who were like, in charge back then, and everyone flows from them, sort of thing. And so when I would start hearing this more recently, it took me a while to really realize that they're not using this word properly at all.
No, they're not. No, they're not. I mean, it's a bigoted religion. So that's all you can say about it. It's just extremely dangerous. It's done the most awful amount of damage to family life. And it's done, apart from anything else, it's done awful damage to women. Because I don't know about what's happening in Canada, but here, where we have a very big welfare state, which is largely all many single-parent women have to live on. They now, by the time their child is 5, they have to start looking for work and childcare. So what is happening is the state is now demanding that women have to leave their homes and go to work full-time. And there is nobody home for children. The concept of a home with a mother or possibly a father in it now doesn't exist.
Yeah, it's sad.
It's very sad because it fulfills. And when you look at what happened in China when they tried it, and Russia, and you realize it's still going on in the West, across the Western world.
Oh, I know what it was. I just remembered, I was trying to think before what it was that Hillary said that first set my radar to her.
Yeah.
She said that, this is when she was still Secretary of State, that the real victims of war are women.
I know, isn't that amazing?
She's referring to the ones at home, and I understand that women do suffer a lot, and maybe we ignore that element of war.
Yeah, but they're not dead.
Yeah, and they're not in the trenches, and...
yeah, not mutilated, they're not, paraplegics. I mean, yeah, sure, it's agony when your child is killed.
I think
the fact is that if Hillary, in her blinkered way, can only see it from a radical women's perspective, then there's something seriously wrong with her thinking.
Because all she would have to say is that women also suffer during times of war. Any kind of statement like that, I could easily go, well, of course, yes. But as soon as she's like, they're the real, then it's exclusionary. Like, men aren't really the victims we think of, because they're a bunch of fighting jerks.
Yeah.
Hopefully she doesn't become the next president, because I don't know how much she could do as president, but I don't want to find out.
No, you definitely don't.
I also don't want Sarah Palin, but, two extremes.
Yes.
Yeah, so when you do your work now, and you go around and talk to people, what are the major misconceptions that you're running up against? I know we've talked about some probably already.
Well, for a start, I'm banned from any feminist conferences, right? I'm banned from even going up the steps of my own refuge, because it's run by a radical feminist. So all the refuges, virtually all except perhaps a handful, are actually run by feminists in the National Federation, or whether it's the other one's called Refuge. And those, basically, no men are allowed to work in the refuges. Boys over 12, or sometimes 9, aren't allowed in. Mothers have to make other arrangements for them. No men can. It's a feminist, whatever. And it's been a massive fraud. It's been a multi-million-pound fraud across the Western world, because the premise that all women are victims of men's violence is proven internationally in all the research, all the studies, that it's not a gender issue, it's a family issue.
Right.
So it's now a question of a tipping point coming. And when we are there now, a couple of years ago, I was in it's a huge festival here called WOW, Women of the World, and it happens on Women's Day on March the 8th. And I went to speak, and I was asked to speak, and it was room packed with women, people standing outside, people up against the walls. And the most exciting thing for me was, normally I would be attacked, at least by half the room. This time, there was a complete understanding that when I finished speaking and said, until men and women come together to work on problems of family violence, nothing is going to change. And these much younger women all stood up for that. So when I'm speaking now, I don't get picketed, I don't get screamed at. People listen, and on Friday I was with a group of social workers who all absolutely understood what I was saying. And in fact, many of them been working with men in social services situations. So it is changing.
I'm glad about that.
Yeah. Oh, it's about time too, though.
Yeah. I've seen the footage recently in, now I know you weren't there, I forget the different speakers that they had there, but University of Toronto, they tried having.
That was Warren Farrell. That was there was another woman who was speaking at another conference. Yes, just recently, they have been storming the conferences and screaming and yelling and behaving really outrageously. But
so one of my I'll just say one of my mentors in life. I went to university for theater.
Mm-hmm.
One of my mentors in theater and in life, is an amazing woman. She refers to herself as a feminist, amongst other things that she is active in. And so during all of this, she has had, I think, a very interesting time watching listening to the things that have been going on with me.
Yeah.
And I find her, she's got her own ideas, but I find her caring and reasonable in that, I remember the way she put it when I was talking about how I hadn't seen my daughter in 9 months. She said, maybe the pendulum in family court has swung the other way. So she's open to hearing what people have to say. So,
yes. It's been swung for a very long time, actually. It's slowly beginning to come back.
But it all depends on the circles you're in, right? If you don't see someone going through it, you're kind of insulated from the effects. You're not feeling it yourself.
Yeah, it's nothing to do with me.
So one of the things that I did point out, I don't remember her commenting on it, but it was on my Facebook, so she probably saw it, was that I pointed out that back in the day, I understand when women would get, back in, say the 20s, they would get into the large lines together and they would chant and they would shout slogans about trying to make things change. And there's a certain context that they were bound together because they might actually be physically attacked. I think that there's some footage of some women actually being physically attacked on the street by men that are really angry at them for the things they're saying. But I said, now things have changed. Now I put up a link to the footage of these women making so much noise around the building you couldn't hear the speaker in the room. I said, this is a bullying tactic. It is threatening. It is something to cause fear. This is no longer about trying to make a statement or a political change. This is about intimidation. So.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, I had it for years and years and years. And everybody involved. In fact, Mary Strauss and Richard Gellis and Susan Steinmetz were the first researchers in America. And I was actually invited out there to meet them. And this was before any research had been done. And they very bravely, believing what they had heard, which is this is what happens to women, began to do the research and very quickly realized exactly what I'd said, that it's not a gender issue. And they said so, and they started to produce their research. And they had, like I did, they had bomb threats and threats. Susan's family was threatened, and it went on for years and years. And, it's extremely difficult when it's that vicious. But you have to remember, it's vicious because it's about funding and money.
Yes.
It was never, ever about women who were victims.
What you said before stunned me, that these are what you're saying is the shelters that you started.
Yeah.
You're no longer allowed in those shelters.
No. In fact, I had a letter last year from my own refuge, which was called Chiswick Women's Aid, and they call themselves Refuge. And when I refer to myself as the founder of the Refuge movement, they've asked me not to use the word refuge because they don't want to be associated with what I have to say.
What is their excuse for a stance like that? That they think that you are a threat of some kind?
Yeah, yes, because they know that I know they're lying. There's been one huge, massive, nearly 50-year-old lie. That all men are perpetrators and all women are victims. It's never been true, ever. And that's very threatening when you've got, when you're huge salaries and vast offices given over to the ideology of some very sick women, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, one of the things that we're talking about, the control issues, you're talking about money and finance. The way that this type of behavior always brims to the surface and becomes as extreme as it does, probably because of attention and money, the desirable effects, right, is this desire to control, to have the power to say who gets punished, how, who's allowed to speak, who's allowed to enter. Yeah. For myself, I haven't gone to conferences, but I am involved with a lot of different groups and people in the atheist and the secular movement, or the skeptics movements. And over the last couple of years, there was a sudden insurrection to take control by extreme feminists. And a lot of these people were well known, well liked by people across the board for their work. And what I have discovered is we look the other way for their mistreatment of believers. And then when they started doing it to us, then suddenly we realized that it was inappropriate. But that's exactly what they did, is they started by saying, you're either with us or against us. If you're not with us, then you're a sexist, you're a misogynist, you're a rape apologist. And they started trying to control who could speak at conferences, who was on the board for conferences. They literally would write a new enforcement policy and say to the conferences, this is your enforcement policy, adopt it or you are against feminism. The kind of control obsession that I find from them is disturbing.
It's only, because one of the primary things that the women's movement said when it all began, the personal is political. And the personal is political means that the disordered personality, which many of them have, will actually not only be in their private life, where they're control freaks, but it'll also be in their public life.
Right.
And then and it is, in a sense, I think you have to say that to be a radical feminist, you have to be pretty disordered, because you are believing in something that hates the other half of the human race. And in order to do that, you are, in your own way, whether you're a Nazi or you're whatever, all the other forms of control and really tyrants, or a Stalinist or whatever, there's no point in reasoning with them. And they will give their whole life is dedicated to creating that power and control. Yeah. And in fact, one of the things about the conferences when all the women's got together was just how the fighting was terrifying, actually. All the different factions.
The combativeness, are you trying to, when I try to convince someone of something, it might get out of hand and it might get a little, overboard, because people believe things that, the passion can build up. But as a rule, when you're trying to talk to someone about something and trying to convince them or help them see your point of view, saying to them, look, you're going to see my point of view, or we're going to call you this terrible name, and we're going to ban you from ever speaking, and we're going to ban you from attending these places. And if you do show up, we're going to make these rules that make sure you get in trouble. We're going to call the police. That is not a way to convince people. It doesn't seem like you're not trying to win them over with truth.
You're being rational again. Dealing with irrational people. Yeah?
I guess so.
I remember this huge promise that there was going to be this new movement for women, which was going to unite women. And I thought it sounded absolutely wonderful, the idea that women would work with each other instead of competing against each other. I never really believed in that early 70s we're all oppressed sort of feminism. I joined a feminist group looking for friendship, not revolution.
Where did you put them?
So I remember going to my first meeting, and we walked into this big room, and there were lots of Chairman Mao posters and women with guns in their hands, and liberation posters, I subsequently found out. But they were very intimidating. And I'm looking at the other women who were also new like I was. And I remember she asked me why I'd come. And I said, well, I'd come because I was lonely and isolated, and I'd hoped to meet other women who wanted to do something in our communities. And she found that really a silly remark, and she said very angrily to me that my problem was my husband, and that he was oppressing me, and that it was all linked to capitalism. And I remember trying to argue and pointing out that I considered it a luxury to be able to stay home and look after my children, that he paid the mortgage, so I didn't see where he was oppressing me.
For me, watching it was like a slow train wreck.
Yes.
Because like I said, at first, it was just kind of, these groups tend to have a lot of liberals in them.
Yes.
And I used to identify, when I was younger as a conservative. Then after university experience, I became a liberal. And then as I became more experienced in the real world, I don't really identify as either, except on a case-by-case basis, I'll decide, what to think. But I've accepted a lot of my friends are really liberal. And so this idea tends to just flow with a lot of the liberals.
Just because they have no personal experience to balance what they're thinking.
Right. And that's the thing, is that when this happened, it took a while for a lot of, not just me, but a lot of liberals to go, whoa, wait a second, someone's accusing me of being a rape apologist because I didn't necessarily agree with one little point. And over time, it was like, again, for them, it was like a rude awakening. Like, well, maybe everything we're told about this word and this movement isn't what we've been told.
Yeah. Most people are asleep. They live their lives asleep, and they're happy to be asleep. They don't want to be woken up. And so they absorb whatever the soup of the day is. If you go along and say, hang on a minute, I want you to open your eyes, they're not going to like you for it. It's much easier to be asleep. It's painful to really look at what happens.
Yeah. There was a two-step thing where it finally came to blows between me and this ideology was permeating. As one, they went after someone that I've been listening to for 2 years named Reap Payton. They just started, he stuck up for someone that he knew, and they just piled on him. And, well, he's the type of guy, rather than bowing down or running away because it's too much, he thrives on fighting bullies. So they picked the wrong guy, and it was a year and a half battle where he was just constantly putting them in their place. So that was the first thing. The second thing was that there's in Canada, there's a podcaster. In his real life, he's a scientist, and they had a 25-minute section on their skepticism show, where they offered no evidence to back up any of their accusations or ideology. And when I made a comment, first comment I had ever made on a podcast, I made a comment. He immediately asked me the question, whether I was the type of guy that issues rape threats online. That was his reply from a scientist.
Why?
Because I was questioning feminism. So I must be someone who goes online and threatens rape.
Again, that's not a rational question, is it?
And that is, like I say, as a skeptic who talks about evidence, like he'll talk about vaccinations and stuff like this on his show. So I just listened for science purposes, right? And then when all of a sudden this section came up, it was out of nowhere. It was completely uncharacteristic of the show.
Yeah.
And I'll admit my comment was maybe to the point. It was a little pointed, but I wasn't swearing or threatening or anything like that. And I used my real name. And so later some people would try to be apologizers for him because they like his show. And I said, look, if we had been talking about child abuse, right? And he had made a comment, on my show, and he had made a comment to me disagreeing on particulars like how to prevent child abuse. And he disagreed with me. And by disagreeing, my return was, by the way, are you someone who looks at kiddie porn? Then it would become immediately obvious how inappropriate the question was. There's just no call for it.
No, but I wonder what made him so threatened.
It's because there's no defending the basis of the ideology. When you really get into the nuts and bolts, it's self-defeating. It's hypocritical. That's my opinion.
Unfortunately, one of the worst offenders in this whole discussion about radical feminism are other men. Because men, don't actually stand together.
No, we don't.
Just recently I've noticed, and I was so glad, it was only probably a couple of years ago, I found A Voice for Men, the online program.
Yep.
And suddenly there were men actually getting together and really making changes. And but one of the things, I've toured other countries and looked at men's groups. Men's groups fell apart one after the other because men didn't know how to deal with each other over emotional issues. And it's one of the biggest laments from men's groups is so many men will come, they'll take all the help they need, and then when they've resolved their problem, they go off. Now, women don't do that. We are within our own psyche. Women are actually enormously supportive of each other normally, and actually obviously confide in each other in a way that men don't. And it's made it very hard because what should have happened all those years ago is groups of men who should have got together and said, this is simply dangerous. You're destroying family life. You're destroying our roles as fathers. For such a long time across the Western world, the whole concept of the need for fathers was considered a joke. No, men aren't necessary. Fathers aren't necessarily. As Harriet Harman, our Member of Parliament, says, men aren't necessarily harmonious to family life. And Patricia Hewitt says, but we can't trust men with children. And these are in positions of power, these women. And they're the same in your country, they're the same in America, Australia, anywhere you look.
You are also an author.
Yes.
Now, you've written a number of books, but if I remember correctly, it's been a while since I heard you talking about it. Wasn't there one of your books that came out that particularly enraged the feminists?
I had to have a police escort around England when I published Prone to Violence. It
Wow.
only stayed on the shelves for 3 weeks. But essentially, yes, it was my treatment program for violence-prone women. And the book is called Prone to Violence, and it talks about women's violence and treatment. Because my feeling is not to judge. Those of us that were born and raised in violence deserve a second chance. And those of us who are born into these dysfunctional families never learn how to live with any kind of peace or harmony. Your strategies for survival tend to be very, very dangerous for you as an individual And that's why most of the work I did in the refuge was with violent women and their children. And because essentially I recognized that they needed counseling. Men and women who by accident get into a violent relationship need support. They probably need refuge, or they need solicitors, they need that kind of help. But many of them don't, once they understand the issue, don't need long-term counseling. But I offered long-term residential counseling, and that was all closed down because no women needed any kind of treatment or counseling, because all women are innocent victims. So the women going into the refuges who were violent themselves and to their children were told that they were innocent victims, and any kind of violence was only in self-defense.
Wow.
Which put women in a very difficult position because it gave them no help.
Yeah, and some of the if they're willing to reach out for help, it should be there. It's very important to be there.
They can't be at the moment. It is getting better, as I say. I think we've reached a tipping point, and I think there'll come a time when sufficient research and sufficient people on top levels. I do a radio program every second week for Voice for Men Radio, and we talk to people like Murray Strauss and all the key people in the field, and anybody can find it on YouTube and listen. And even being able to get all these people together to talk about these issues is wonderful, particularly for men or women who don't have access to this sort of information.
Yeah. Yeah.
Often men, don't even recognize that they're being abused. They've been abused by their mothers, and they have remade the relationships with their partners who have the same personality disorders as their mothers, which is a tragedy. And they don't even wake up until it's far too late.
I remember in my initial interview with the social worker that represented my daughter, she sat down with me, and I was later told by somebody who works with foster children. They said, well, when you talk to her, you need to be very honest. And I said, well, that's the way I am. Yeah. So I think she responded well to the fact that she knew I was just answering right off the cuff. I wasn't trying to compose my answers just right or anything. And at one point, though, when I was talking about my experiences living in the home over the last few years, the social worker who does this work all the time put her pen down and looked at me, and she goes, Corey, why the hell did you stay there so long?
Yeah.
And it was a real moment of I felt really ashamed, though. I was like, the only thing I can think to tell you is that when you're in that situation, you're just trying to hold your family together. You're not clear on what's happening.
Yeah.
Like, looking back clearly, I can see what you're saying. Like, now I know. Mm. But at the time, you're doing it out of love, right? You're trying to hold it all together.
And also, you're trying to make it better. Particularly men, they will try and try and try.
Yeah.
And the feeling that if you can't make her better, then you're the failure. And for a long time, an awful lot of men think it's all their fault anyway.
Yeah. Well,
a lot of the time, it's just talking to people who are confused because they see their partner who is violent and manipulative, and they don't realize there is a mask of sanity there that's there for a time, and then the mask comes off.
Yeah, and I think for me, like I say, it was also that it deteriorated over time.
Mm-hmm, it does.
Yeah.
And also because you see, one of the things about violent people, there's always the honeymoon periods, because they know how to play that game extremely well.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure if you're very familiar with the skeptics movement. You deal with AVfM. Some of them, I think, are involved in some ways with it.
Well, my position is simple. I've never been uncomfortable with organized religion, but I am a lover of God in all his aspects. I don't see the creator of the universe as either male or female, but I believe passionately, and I have a very strong relationship with my concept of God. Nobody else would actually even begin to know what it is, but I believe in it, and it's personal.
Well, there are some skeptics who are. There's a lot of atheists in that movement. There are some who are really difficult to get along with if you do believe in God. But my background, I get into arguments with them a lot of times because my background is my whole family are Christians.
Yeah.
And I try reminding them not to lose sight of the fact that because someone believes does not mean they are a source of your problems.
No, absolutely not. No. And again, any kind of fanaticism, whether it's religious, it's not that different from radical feminism. It is their core belief, and if you dare to cross that and even challenge it, they cannot deal with the dysfunction feeling that it gives them.
Well, as long as you can talk to someone about your disagreements in a productive fashion,
then you know they're normal.
Yeah, that's right.
If not, then don't waste your breath. I'm terribly, I have a shining path. And on that shining path, I only allow people who want to share in that love and that acceptance. And if they begin to bring their malign or toxic attitudes, then I don't let them on my path. I'll deal with them, but I am very straight about what I'm prepared to have around me.
Yeah.
It's too short. The battle's too big. You cannot immerse yourself in the kind of negativity that people will pull you into.
Chiswick. Women's Aid Archive. Circa 1970s.
Number 2 Belmont Terrace, a short-life property, was leased to Chiswick Women's Aid by Hounslow Council as a community centre for women. The women did most of the decorating themselves. Erin Pizzey, who started the centre, had originally seen it just as a place where women could come to sit and chat. One room was used as a playgroup, another served as a discussion place, where the women could sit and talk over their problems.
And then it was at that time when this woman came in and just took her jersey off and showed us these appalling bruises, and her breasts were just like sort of bowls of blue jelly, and said that her husband had beaten her very badly, and no one would help her. And she was standing in front of me, and I knew what she meant, and it was very shattering for me, because I'd believed that I was an isolated person within my own childhood experience, and that there was help and provision, because I believed in the social services and all the various other institutions. So when she said, nobody will help me, I knew what she meant, and I said, you'd better stay. And she stayed. As the word spread locally, women started to come in. They just came to the doorstep with their children and said, please let me in, no one will help. And began to build up this dossier of terrible, relentless uncaring on the part of all the services in the country. Nobody seemed to be doing anything constructive to help. They just seemed to be sending these women back to the men who beat them, and some back to be killed.
The open door policy of Chiswick Women's Aid meant that, on average, some 40 women and children were staying in the 4-roomed house at any one time. After 18 months, the house was due for demolition.
Well, the reason I brought up the skeptics movement is because, as opposed to the atheist groups that are out there, the feminists really nailed the atheist groups. A lot of people were turned over. They started rewriting, like I say, the policies for enforcement and wrongdoing at the conferences. They got people fired from very important positions for not agreeing with them.
Yeah.
Well, when it came to the skeptics movements, there's kind of an interlinking with a lot of people between the two.
Yeah.
But the difference is skepticism specifically is about evidence and logic. So when they moved into that area, that was their mistake.
Yeah.
They really overplayed their hand because they don't have evidence to back up their ideology.
Actually don't. None of it.
So what happened was, I noticed that they went after a number of people. Some people have really suffered for it, though. Like Michael Shermer. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. He is one of the people who basically sets the pace for what skepticism is. He did a lot of he's presented a lot of the foundational work on how to reason out of your own biases.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he was accused publicly by another so-called skeptic who was a feminist of being someone who went and got women drunk and raped them.
Yeah. That was that's a tactic they've used a lot, actually, on leaders in the field. Yeah.
He's not the only one. They've done it to a couple of others. And this is their way they target leadership or people who are considered really foundational or important, and they try to smear them.
Yeah. Experience in publishing, because I was writing novels, and because you don't choose your editors, they're given to you. And of course, I didn't realize to begin with that the editors I was given were radical feminist editors. And in the 80s, they were epidemic in the publishing world. And they bankrupted me. They tore up my contract. And I ended up in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I lost my house. I lost my daughter's house. I lost everything.
Wow.
And that's happened twice to me. It happened again about 10 years ago when I was in Italy writing novels, and I didn't realize. But to cut a long story short, she remained at all my backlist for HarperCollins, so no one could get my books, no libraries could get them. And she just said, no one will ever publish you again. So this book, This Way to the Revolution, it took me 10 years to find a publisher. It's a very small publisher, a very dedicated publisher. And they were quite convinced that because it was my autobiography of those years, that they would get good publicity and reviews. And I said, there will not be one single review. And they used that word, which you will hear many times when you try and battle, don't be paranoid. And of course, when the book came out, not one single review.
Wow.
But at least it's there and people can buy it. And it's on it as an ebook now as well.
Oh, so good. It makes it really accessible these days when you can put it on the ebook. Those kind of tactics really enrage me. You know, I believe in honest discourse. And I had a fellow on our show. He's a biblical scholar. His name's Dr. Price. And first of all, I love his work. I follow his work on his podcast and stuff like that. He's phenomenal. But the reason I had him on the show was because in these circles I've been telling you about, he tends to be politically a conservative. He doesn't talk about those views very much. Whereas I tend to lean left, he tends to lean right. But he's like me; he's like a case by case. But
yeah,
I've just noticed he has a lot of differing points of view.
Yeah,
but he doesn't talk about them. So I had him on my show, and we discussed that because I told him I prefer when not everyone in the room has to nod their head in agreement. I don't like that. How we disagree with each other is just as important, maybe more important, than how we agree.
Yeah. But the most important thing out of all this and everything that we've been saying is more and more people need to stand up and be counted.
Yes.
Because these women can only get away with it when it's in secret and they can pursue the people they see as their prey, which largely, unfortunately, is right the way across universities in the Western world, because that's the feeding ground where they brainwash the young female students, and male sometimes, young female students into this realization that all men are incredibly dangerous. And there are factories now, really, many of the universities. And the tragedy is that for many of the young girls, it takes years for them to realize that it has been a completely abnormal existence that they have been offered.
And, I guess I would say, in the end, what good is it to replace one set of victims with another? If people really want to address concerns that are particular to women, they can't do it in isolation, and they can't go about it dishonestly. Like I think most people are willing to have the discussion, but once you start demonizing the other sex in favor of one sex, you're just tipping the balance to cause the very problems that you've been saying that you're against.
Again, yes, I understand that, but I suppose young girls are very vulnerable, particularly if they have had violent fathers, and they're often the ones that are most likely to be brainwashed successfully and then move on to become totally radicalized against men, because then the idea that the family is a dangerous place for women makes sense to them. This is their core belief, because that is what happened to them as children.
Yeah.
And instead of being able to recognize that in domestic, one of the things that made me compassionate towards my mother and father was knowing their history and thinking to myself, no wonder she was as she was, because she was absolutely hated by her stepmother and very badly abused. And the same with my father. Interestingly enough, it was his mother, because by the time the 17th child had come along, she had no time for him. And so my feeling is that it's extremely important that now, particularly with the situation as it is, with Hillary Clinton now trying to make the Violence Against Women Act to go global, if she gets in, that we really seriously need to recruit more people, and particularly men, stand up and be counted, because it's all very well, as long as they keep their heads down, they'll be fine until by accident they get involved.
It's too often that people wait till they are personally affected. Like I say, I should have been more critical of these things well before. And, I even knew people who had been affected, but it's convenient to just ignore it until it comes for you.
But particularly also, men are, from when they're tiny, taught to believe that they're mothers and to put women on pedestals. And that's often fathers. I always remember most fathers will say when there's an upset in the family, what did you do, he says to the children, to upset your mother?
Yeah.
Which is very, very confusing for a child, because often the child is completely innocent. It's the mother who has wreaked some kind of vengeance on the child. So the child is brought up to think of themselves, if they criticize their mother, that somehow it's their fault, whatever she does.
Well, my little girl, one of the things that she's been having to do is eat gluten or gluten-free food, because of all the stuff her mother says is going on. Anyways, long story short, the gluten-free thing doesn't hold any science. Like, I looked into it before I dismissed it. And it's been this whole big thing where she sends a lunch with our daughter whenever I get to see her. It tells our daughter, you have to eat what mommy sends you because daddy will give you bad food.
Yeah, poison you.
And so my daughter just says, I give her the choice. I don't want her to put her in the middle. No. And she always chooses to eat what the rest of us eat. But at the beginning of each visit, she always says, Daddy, I have to eat this lunch because I want mommy to be proud of me. Yeah. It's so sad, you know.
It's terribly sad. And then she already has to, when she goes back, you know that every second she's been with you, she'll get grilled.
Yeah.
And she knows that. And now she's either going to lie to her mother or tell the truth. And possibly what she does is she's already beginning to have to lie.
Yeah.
That's not good.
And this is another thing that, like I say, to her credit, the social worker picked up on, and even the child psychologist that my daughter has made mention of it. So people are becoming aware. Like I say, I think there is a changing attitude.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think there's a whole... See, I'm talking about women of my age group, 75, in their, let's say, 60s, that 15 years, or even 55, so let's say that decade. You know, and they were the worst because they were the first, and they were the ones that brainwashed their daughters and had their sons and on down. But there is the whole new generation coming up who are now probably in their 30s and coming up for 40s, who, although they've heard all this, have been far enough away from it to stay rational. And so my feeling is, hopefully, as they flood into into the various agencies, the climate will change, and it'll change for the better, and men and women will be seen for what they really are. And also, I hope, will bring to the whole discussion of how we handle taking care of mothers, fathers, and children, to look at generational family violence and the understanding of how, if a mother is brought up by, like I was, by a narcissistic exhibitionist, then there are certain things that need to happen for that child so they don't repeat the pattern.
Yeah. Changing that cycle of a disturbed family behavior.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And it can be changed, because that's why in my projects, some of the women stayed in the projects for up to 4 or 5 years, because the brain is plastic. The brain can always change. The younger you have the child, the easier it is for the child to change. But even much, much later, you can change. And you can change the way your brain thinks and absorbs information. And that's the great hope.
I think that's a good spot for us to end the interview. I really appreciate you coming and talking to me.
Good call. I hope to see you at some point. Anyway, I wish you the very best of luck, and eventually you may well simply have to go for full custody.
Well, we'll see. We'll see what she decides to do anyway.
Yeah. So does this go out? Was it live, or do you have a chance to make changes with it, or what happens?
Well, I do edit, but I don't edit for content. I just I take out the spaces and I take the background noise if there's any. I take that out. Okay. Just to give you a warning. I do sometimes with your case, I will look for any audio clips that apply to your work that you've done, and I'll put them in certain part, like every 20 or 30 minutes, I'll set them in for about a minute.
Yeah.
And there's 2 reasons I do that. One is when I have a guest, especially like yourself, I try to use it as a starting point for my audience to encourage them to look into what you're talking about and to your work. Yeah. So it's kind of like I'm trying to showcase you not just with the interview, but also with some other stuff.
Yeah.
And also because I personally, being a person who listens to a lot of podcasts, I find that your attention, no matter how interested you are, tends to drift.
Yeah.
So by putting that in there, I think I'm able to keep people focused on what we're talking about.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah.
Does that go on YouTube eventually?
Well, I have a site where you can listen to it or download it.
Well, that's good, because what I really desperately need to get to, which is why I do that radio show, is I need men who are absolutely desperate to have places where they can go and listen to the arguments, and so they can make up their own mind, because there's so little for men.
Yeah. Well, we have a number of topics that we talk about, but this is one where I find there is a lot of people I know are afraid to talk about it.
Yeah, sure.
And I'm not really the back down type of guy, but I wanted to do it in a way that, like I say, your experience brings something to the table that a lot of discussions lack.
Yeah. Unfortunately, yes, I do. Yeah, but it is getting better. And, I hope if before I die, we manage to actually demolish the entire structure of the radical feminist patriarch argument, and it is generally accepted that it is a family issue, then I feel I'll have achieved something.
Yeah, definitely. Is there anything that you want to point the audience towards? I'm going to do in the show notes. I'm going to put links to any place you want me to send people.
Well, they could have a look at my website. That's erinpizzey.com.
Okay, I'll also put a link, like I say, in the show notes.
Yeah, and also to the book, This Way to the Revolution, because that really gives you the whole history's laid out there.
Yeah, I'm going to get myself a copy of that.
Okay, because people don't realize the history. You see, they don't know that it was never a women's movement. It was always, as it always has been. You know, it was essentially a Marxist movement, a feminist Marxist movement to create jobs for the girls, and they've been awfully successful if you think about it.
Well, probably the only reason I so quickly understood what you're talking about when I heard you make that reference, I think probably on AVfM at some point, was because I had listened to that multi-hour program going through and identifying how we are all prone to get involved in ideology until we start identifying the problems with ideology itself.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, extraordinary.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Like I said, taking the time.
Good. Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye. One last thanks to Erin for coming out. That's Erin Pizzey. You can find her on her own website. I'm going to put show note links to the different places you can find her. Listening back to the interview while I was doing the editing, I have to tell you that halfway through her book, This Way to the Revolution, and Erin has quickly become a hero of mine. Everything in the story, as most people hear, it starts in 1971, but her history goes back further. I think the book is really worth a listen. I highly recommend it, and I highly recommend becoming more familiar with her work and the people that she works with, trying to bring this into focus for the family, rather than blaming someone's gender for all of these types of terrible things that happen to people, particularly to children. I want to say thank you as well to A Voice for Men for helping me connect to Erin, and for continuing to try to work with her to raise people's awareness about the issues she's concerned about. And in particular, Dean Esme played a vital role there. So I'm going to have those links up for their site, for her sites, and about her book in the show notes. I highly recommend it. It's called This Way to the Revolution. You can get it on ebook, and I think most of my audience is savvy enough to find all of that. Check out the show notes again. And I want to thank everyone who listened through the entire thing, who are having the discussions, are honestly wrestling with these ideas. And if you're still trying to come up with answers, if you haven't been through this yourself, may I humbly recommend that you talk to someone that you care about and that you trust, who has themselves been through the family courts, and ask them what their observations were, what kind of difficulties they had. That might help inform you from a more personal point of view. And, of course, always look into research and data and how it's done before you believe what someone says. Be skeptical. Tune in next time. Our next guest is going to be my friend Terry Say, whose last name I say correctly. I'm quite proud. Smashlock will join us for that interview. Till then, peace.
Thank you, Mr. Willie. Thank you. You've made my day.
Just as a little bonus, for anyone who cares to stick around, I'm going to throw a song on called Mutation. Something I've been working on. In short, it's something that I use modern-day superhero movies and television shows to kind of go through the motions of individual change and how it kind of connects with species change. I hope you enjoy it. If not, skip it.
Mutation. It is the key to our evolution. It has enabled us to evolve from a single-celled organism into the dominant species on the planet. This process is slow, normally taking thousands and thousands of years. But every few hundred millennia, evolution leaps
film amplifies everything that's inside. So, good becomes great. Bad becomes worse. This is why you were chosen. Because the strong man, who has known power all his life, may lose respect for that power. But a weak man knows the value of strength and knows compassion.
But your father meant by a philosophy, a principle, really. He believed that if you could do good things for other people, you had a moral obligation to do those things. That's what's at stake here. Not choice, responsibility.
Notation. With great power. Notation. Comes great responsibility.
Carlos.
My son, you do not remember me. My son, you do not remember me. It is forbidden for you to interfere with human history.
The son becomes the father. The father becomes the son.
Remember me, my son.
I'll never forget.
My son, you do not remember me. My son, you do not remember me. It is forbidden for you to interfere with human history. My son, you do not remember me. My son, you do not remember me. It is forbidden for you to interfere with human history. My son, you do not remember me. My son, you do not remember me. It is forbidden for you to interfere. Notation.
Because she's everything I want in life. Heather, I love her.
Oh, hi,
Carlos.
You have a sacred birthright, daughter. You were chosen to destroy vampires.
Notation.
I'm 16 years old. I don't want to die.
Compassion.
It's always complicated. And at some point, someone has to draw the line, and that is always going to be me. You get down on me, cutting myself off, but in the end, the player is always cut off. There's no mystical guidebook, no all-knowing counsel. Human rules don't apply. There's only me. I am me.
Notation.
I don't want to die.
Notation.
I don't want to die.
Notation. We're not what you think.
You are unique among your brothers. For you choose to face this enemy alone.
Notation.
But as you face it, do not forget them. And do not forget me.
Compassion.
I am here, my son.
Notation.
I don't want to die.
Notation.